Crowd. Have we got all we're going to get crowd-wise? They'll drag in. Well, let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to go through 20 verses in Daniel chapter 11. Now, we're skipping from 8 to 11 because they kind of bookend. What happens in 9 and 10 has to do with Daniel's 70 weeks. And we get there, we're probably going to really slow down and kind of dig into what was revealed to Daniel in that passage of Scripture. But it's in Daniel chapter 10 that we see the 70, is Daniel 9 or Daniel 10, that we see the 70 weeks that are set aside for his people, which has a lot to do with prophecy and has a lot to do with end times. And so we're going to kind of slow down, and we're going to look at different ways that can be looked at or interpreted, things like that. And we'll probably hit on wherever it is that you fall as far as how you think it's all going to end up. We're just going to look at a lot of the major theories. Whenever there's that many theories about one event or two events or a group of events, that means that we don't really know, and we're kind of stabbing at it. Of course, with Daniel, we're dealing with visions. We're dealing with what's called apocalyptic literature, which is this kind of literature has a lot of signs and symbols and visions, and as we saw with the animals that represent the different nations that he's dealing with at that time. And so when we get to Daniel chapter 11, he kind of we jump over 9 and 10, and we're going to pick up a little bit later on, but it kind of follows up real close on what we've looked at so far with these four beasts, the ones that are in Daniel's time. And we're going to look at kind of dates and historical information tonight. This chapter is one of the most dense prophetic chapters in the entirety of Scripture. It has so much packed into it. And what makes Daniel chapter 11 so amazing is it is so accurate to how history actually unfurled that a lot of people question it being as old a document as it is. The problem is it was quoted way back when. And it was references to it. Now, I have heard, and I couldn't verify this today, I tried to vet it out, that when Alexander the Great kind of got to Jerusalem, got into that area, they saw him, they recognized. I have heard that the some of the symbols that they would wear on their uniforms had a goat on it. And now I can't verify that. Although a goat was something, or a ram was something that they did use in that day, it wasn't their major symbol. One of the major symbols he used was the eagle. And so, that would have been something that had been recognizable because it's a lot like Rome, and they have their eagle. And so a lot of people like to say we can prove that Daniel's as old as it is because when he got to Jerusalem, they looked at him and said, "You're the goat." And they knew he was coming because of Daniel's writing. And as exciting as that is, I can't prove it, so I'm not going to teach it that way. But if it did happen that way, wouldn't it be astounding that they were ready for Alexander the Great because they'd been reading Daniel's writings? And I do believe they were reading Daniel's writings back when Alexander the Great came through, and I think they identified him really quickly as that goat that had the one horn. He was the horn of that goat that broke off into four. So we've been talking about that, and I'm going to jump ahead to where that kind of story is continued, and then we're going to continue to look at that. So we're dealing with the kings of Persia, Greece, and north and south. And remember, he saw four beasts, and we're past the time where we're seeing Nebuchadnezzar because we're already into the Medes and Persians by this point. And so when Daniel's shown the future, he's shown things that are going to happen in his lifetime, but a lot of it happens after Daniel's lifetime, but he wrote about it before it happened. So that's what makes this so intriguing to a lot of people is accuracy, that you can go back. And you're going to read this, and I'm going to read the verses tonight, and you're going to be like, how do they get that out of that? Because it doesn't look that obvious to me, but it's the style of writing. People of that era understood that style of writing. It's like reading Shakespearean English. Anybody ever try to read Shakespearean or Anglo-Saxon? You try to... Or read some of our founding fathers, or even like, you go back and you look at like the Reformation, go back 500 years ago and look at how those people wrote. The vocabulary is astounding. We're not getting smarter. Okay. Just astounding, isn't it? Yeah. Very, very, very intelligent. And it came out in their writing. So it's amazing that the people of that day understood it completely. But when we go back and read it, we got some words, we got to get a vocabulary out. and a dictionary and look at it and say, what does that word exactly mean? I did that a couple times today, making sure that I understood. I was reading some older writers about Daniel, and they used some words that I wasn't familiar with, and I had to go look them up. That's always a wise thing to do so that you know where you're at. So let's just kind of dig into this. We're going to try to do 20 verses. We will do what we get done. This one is a salami-like teaching. I can cut it off anywhere because we're just going to go through the history. Because what we're headed for is Antiochus Epiphanes, and he begins in verse 21. And so next week we'll do 21 through 35 basically. 35 is when everybody says it makes a switch. So we'll look at 21 through 35, and we can readily identify Antiochus Epiphanes. He's the one I told you about that came in and set up the statue to Zeus in the temple, slaughtered a sow on the altar, caused the big rebellion, the Maccabean revolt that you can read about in 1st and 2nd Maccabees in the Apocrypha. So these things are historically written about, and they identify back to Daniel. It's amazing the clarity, even though it wasn't really clear because Daniel didn't understand what he was saying. So let's just go through some verses. And I got notes up here with me tonight. I'm trying to do it a different way so I don't say, Clay, change that slide. Clay, do this. Clay, do that. I'm trying to make things more fluid. You're never too old to learn, right? And practice something new. So Daniel 11, 1 through 20 traces the real history from about 539 BC. So get that in your head. 539 BC with Darius the Mede. Through the Persian kings, all of those, the rise and fall of Alexander the Great, and his rise and fall was 336 to 323, and the long conflict between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids in 3rd and 2nd centuries BC, ending with the death of Seleucus IV in 175 BC, right before Antiochus IV, who's called Antiochus Epiphanes, steps into the stage in verse 21. So 21 to 35, we're reading about Antiochus Epiphanes. He's the guy that caused all the problem, caused the revolt. Leading up to that, and Daniel's long since dead when all these things are happening. So remember that. You have to keep that in your mind that Daniel was shown these things as an older man. He's in his 80s or later, and he's getting this revelation, and it bothers him. It affects him. And so when we get into chapter 9 and chapter 10, he has another vision, and that
There we go. This picks up. The batteries are dead. We're getting more batteries. Hi, Verna.
come on. Now I'm hot.
Hey,
All
Ron.
right, now we go. So we're going to be covering lots and lots of years. We're going to get down to about 175 BC. So that's the silent years. We don't have anything written in the scripture. If you read the book of Malachi, as one of my professors says, Malachi, you read that, and it's about 400 years before God says anything else. But what's interesting, the last thing he says in Malachi is, be ready, he's coming. And now that's boiled down. That's the Rusty Standard Version. But that's basically what it says. The promises are on their way. He's coming. I think Clay has a magnet for the fridge. It says, Jesus is coming back. Look busy. And that's kind of the way Malachi ends. He's coming. This is all we need to tell you. Live accordingly. But, God's people don't do well with that, do we? We get a little squirrely sometimes. The world around us has a great effect. And so this is what we're going to be looking at in here. So let me get on into this. And as for me, in the first year of Darius the Mede, I stood up to confirm and strengthen him. Now here's what's interesting. This isn't Daniel speaking. This is the angel messenger that came to Daniel in chapter 10 and was explaining to him the 70 weeks that are appointed for Daniel's people being the Jews. He talks about Michael being one of the only angels that was still fighting with him, and he had to go back, and there was going to be one of the higher ups from Greece, and we're talking angelic beings. There's spiritual warfare going on, and it's explained here, talking about Michael and these angels, and we're going to get into that in depth when we go back and pick up 9 and 10, because that gets really, it's exciting. So anyway, so this angel is continuing from chapter 10, says he supported Darius as God's transitional power from Babylon to Persia. So, Darius is at the beginning of that. It was a transition, and this angelic messenger that came to explain to Daniel in chapter 10 what was going to be happening with the Jews in the future, as he's reporting to Daniel, he says this, "As for me, in the first year of Darius, I stood up to confirm and strengthen him." Now I want you to understand that God can use his messengers to support pagan kings so that God's program continues. His program never gets off kilter because there's this pagan king that doesn't want to do things the right way. So God even sent his messengers to help support. We won't go anywhere while it's raining like that, will we? So we'll just keep going tonight till we get finished. So you can see that even pagan kings are strengthened by God's agents to accomplish his purpose. That's a key truth we can take from verse number 1. I mean, that's a truth that we can look at and we say, you know what, God did this because his program, his plan is so important that he's placing people in the right position, even though they don't believe in him. He's supporting them, strengthening them so that God's program for the Jews at this time would go forward, which is always pointing to Christ and his first coming. And then verse 2 says, "And now I will show you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings shall arise in Persia, and a 4th shall be far richer than all of them. And when he has become strong through his riches, he shall stir up all against the kingdom of Greece." And so this is the promise of the next 3 kings and then a 4th one that's going to come for Greece. And so ahead of time, way before it ever happened, Daniel was told that this was going to happen. So the 3 kings after Cyrus were Cambyses, Pseudo-Smerdis, and Darius the First. And we're familiar with Darius. And so those were the next kings. And the 4th king that was coming is a cat named Xerxes. And if you were here for Esther, you know that's Ahasuerus. And so that's the 4th king that's referred to in this second verse here. The 4th king that he refers to that's going to become strong and rich and powerful is actually the Xerxes. And the people of Israel were free to go back to their home at that point. We know that Esther and her family stayed. And we have that wonderful story of Esther with Ahasuerus or Xerxes that we studied a little while ago. And this provoked Greece, and it sets the stage for Alexander. Verse 3, "Then a mighty king shall arise who shall rule with great dominion and do as he wills." I know you think all kings operate that way, but this one's going to be a special one. This is Alexander the Great. He's represented here, the mighty king that will arise and shall rule with great dominion. He had the largest kingdom, and he took it over in nothing flat. I mean, he was just an amazing study to go back and look at Alexander and his campaigns. I keep wanting to mention the city. And this, of course, is Alexander the Great. 336 is when he became king, and 323 is when he died. So we're not talking about 13 years, right? Just a little bit short time, right? His human brilliance does not override God's sovereignty. God knew about this. He knew Alexander was going to come. He knew he was going to conquer. He's going to be part of God's program. He's going to be part of God's plan. Even the Hellenization, if you will, of the Jewish people, and to Hellenize something means to adapt Greek culture. And the Greek culture was so high and so great in a lot of eyes, the way they did the way they did their politics and things like that, and the way they did like their statuary. Their statuary was so perfect that they wouldn't keep statuary that had flaws in it. Now the Romans, when they come, they liked Greek statues. They loved the way they did it, but they didn't care so much about it. And they would actually, if they had one that had crack in, they would pack it with wax. And then the sun would reveal that it had wax in it, and it would start to run. And that's actually a term that's used in the New Testament. What's the word? I just had it. It just went right out of my head. But it means to be without wax. Sincere. So there's a word that's translated sincere that means to be without wax. And it's referring to like the Roman statuary, that they would hide their flaws with wax. And I've also heard other scholars say, well, that's not really what it means, but it sure does preach good. I like it. Anyway, have Alexander the Great represented here right off the bat. And then in verse 4 it says, "As soon as he has arisen, his kingdom shall be broken and divided toward the 4 winds of the heaven. and not to his posterity, not to his kids, nor according to the authority which he ruled, for his kingdom shall be plucked up and go to others beside these. And we've already talked about, this is in greater depth to the four kingdoms that rise up. Alexander died suddenly in 323 BC. His empire was split among four generals, not his children. He didn't have any children. And this is about 301. When by the time it was all said and done, they got it split up, and you got the Potomacs and the Seleucids, and you got the other two, the Cassians, and I forget the other one. So it took all the way down to 300 years before Christ. Daniel's long since dead, but it happened just this way. And that's what's amazing. And so I'm using Encyclopedia Britannica and other resources to get my dates, just so that we can see this is what Daniel's prophesying way back at about 500 BC. And this is all happening at 300 BC, all the way down to 175. Verse 5 says, "And the king of the south shall be strong, but one of his princes shall be stronger than he, and shall rule, and his authority shall be a great authority." So the explanation of this verse is the king of the south is the Ptolemies. The Ptolemies had Egypt. As a matter of fact, several of the Ptolemaic kings and generals were Egyptian, part Egyptian. Ptolemy was one of Alexander's generals, and he got the Egyptian part of it, which kind of creeps up into Israel, and that's why it's a major player in Scripture. One of his princes becomes stronger, and that would be Seleucus the First, who builds a larger empire than Ptolemy did. Israel's caught between these two powers. So when we're reading in Daniel chapter 11, it talks about the north and the south king, north king, south king, north king, south king. It's talking about these two generals. And it's the division of Alexander's kingdom that wound up with these two generals that fought. And we have recorded history, because by this time in history, we have far more recorded history. The Greeks were really good at recording history, and so were the Romans. And they wrote down history, and they kept that. Now, I mean, it's always accurate, much like today. There's historical revisionists that would come in and make the king sound a little bit better. And they would change some things. Egypt did the same thing. Egypt had a female pharaoh. And they decided they didn't like that look, and so after she passed off the scene, they chiseled her face off of almost every single statue, because they thought, we can't have a female queen. Even though they had a female queen, and she's recorded in history, and we know she was there, and we know she did great things, what do we do later on? We just chisel her face off of statues and change them. Replaster them, retool it, but a lot of that's just scarred up and defaced still today, because it's revisionist history. They like to do that. So this timeline's about 312 to 301. This is when all this kind of thing is going on. After some years they shall make an alliance, and the daughter of the king of the south shall come to the king of the north to make an agreement. And she shall not retain the strength of her arm, and he and his arm shall not endure. But she shall be given up, and her attendants, he who fathered her, and he who supported her in those times. Now, this is an interesting story. I don't know if you've heard of Bernice, but Bernice, you can study about her in ancient history. So Ptolemy II gives his daughter Bernice to Antiochus II to seal peace between the northern and the southern kingdom. Daniel talks about it right here, about giving up the daughter to do that. Bernice is the one that did that. Antiochus returns to his former wife, Laodice, L-A-O-D-I-C-E, Laodice. It's where we get Laodicean. If you're familiar with Revelation, you're familiar with the Laodicean church, right? So Laodice, who murders him and Bernice and their son together. So he comes back to his previous wife. He says, "Look, honey, I've got a new wife." And she says, "Not for long." And she kills him, kills her, kills their son. Kills her son, kills Bernice's son, because she wants her son to reign. And that just shows you how God works in history. You think there's a coup going on. There's not really a coup. God says you only think for a minute there's a coup. But my plan will continue. And again, our whole study in Daniel is about God's sovereignty over the issues of the world, over the issues, over the kingdoms, over the animal life. God is sovereign. He has absolute, ultimate, and total authority over all these things. That's why it's easy for him to go to Daniel and say, okay, here's how it's going to go. This is going to happen. There's going to be this king. They're going to fight for a while. This one king is going to give his daughter to this other king so that she can be married, but she's not going to remain strong. She's not going to have an effect, and sure enough, she was killed. So it's the historical precision that you can draw from this verse. It's historically accurate, even down to a daughter of a king marrying another king to bring peace. And didn't bring peace. It created more wars, and that's what we're getting ready to see. And from a branch from her roots one shall arise in his place. He shall come against the army and enter the fortress of the king of the north, and he shall deal with them and shall prevail. And so this is about 246 to 241. Bernice's brother, Ptolemy III, invades Syria to avenge her death and plunders temples and returns to Egypt. So just like it says right here, this is how this is going to go. And now from history, we look back and we see with 2020, we can say, well, that fits perfectly. And that's what I mean. It's the design and how God makes things happen is just absolutely amazing. And human vengeance cannot thwart God's pre-planned timeline. God's timeline is going to go on. You can't change God's timeline with your obedience or disobedience. If you decide you don't want to be used by the Father, guess what He'll do? He'll use somebody else. His plan will go on. That's why I think it's so amazing when we think about Mary and the birth of Jesus, that God sent, what do you think? And she says, it'll be rough, but okay. That's my standard version. But you can imagine this young girl at 13, 14, 15, somewhere in there, and God says, hey, listen, I'd like to use a vessel, and you're going to carry the king. And she said, as you have said, thy will be done. And the life that she had to live because of that. But you think about the blessings and the cursings, and even she was even told that a spear is going to pierce her too, because she's going to watch him be crucified. That was her child. And so it's an amazing thing to see people that are willing to, no matter what it takes, no matter what it costs, I want to serve the Lord. And we think about that as being high and exalted, but the truth of the matter is, if we really have a good grasp of who God is and what He's done for us, it's a whole lot easier to be a willing servant, be a willing vessel for God to use in any way that He deems right, whether we understand it or not, because it's for His glory. And it'll always be for our benefit. I can't wait to get to heaven and talk to Mary. I just want to find out, what was life like as a young Jewish maiden with a baby born out of wedlock, and everybody knew it. It was rough around here in the 50s if that was the case, wasn't it? Can you imagine back then? They were known to stone these little ladies. And she said, according to your will, let's do this. And I think that's amazing, thinking about her. And then we go on, it says, he shall carry off to Egypt their gods and their metal images and their precious vessels of silver and gold, and for some years he shall refrain from attacking the king of the north. And so this happens in about 246 to 241 BC. Bernice's brother, Ptolemy III, invaded Syria to avenge her death, and he plunders temples and returns to Egypt. I just read that, didn't I? That was two verses supposed to have been together, 7 and 8. So that's that whole thing contained in those two verses. And then verses 9 and 10, it says, then the latter shall come into the realm of the king to the south, but shall return to his own land. His son shall wage war and assemble a multitude of great forces, which shall keep coming to overflow and pass through, and again shall carry the war as far as his fortress. And so Seleucus II launches an attack on Egypt, and he fails, which is prophesied here, going to carry off all those gods and all that, but he fails. His son, Seleucus III and Antiochus III, also known as Antiochus the Great, continues that fight. So we have wars and battles, the northern king, southern king, northern king, southern king. All that happened between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids is back and forth until Rome steps in way down the road and says, you got to stop. And Rome does that with Antiochus Epiphanes, and we're going to focus on him next week. In verse 9, the king of the north attacks but retreats. Seleucus II, Calcinus, attacks Syria in 246, 225. He attempts retaliation. He's unsuccessful. His campaign against Egypt was forced to withdraw in 242 to 240. I love how this is just recorded just as it was prophesied. And then verse 10, his son stirs up war, overflow to pass through. The sons of Seleucus II, Seleucus III was Cyrannus, Antiochus III called the Great. Antiochus III pushes south and recovers lost territories, and all this is happening in about 187, between 223 and 187. And then the Fourth Syrian War begins in 219 to 217. So we're hundreds of years past Daniel. Daniel had these prophecies about these kings, of king of the north, king of the south, the four generals that were going to take over and how they were going to fight back and forth. The daughter was going to get married, but it wasn't going to help anything because there's going to be tumult, and it causes more war, and all of this is prophesied in Daniel. Of course, if you're Daniel looking at this, you're like, I don't have a clue what this means. But looking back through the lens of history, we can see that's exactly what God told Daniel. And Daniel was faithful enough to write it just as it was given to him, even though it didn't make a lot of sense to him. But he wrote it down, and then we get the benefit of looking back and say, you know what? God spoke to Daniel. Daniel knew things you couldn't possibly know unless the Lord told you. And that's kind of the point. And what's important about that are the things that are still yet future. So there's a couple ways to look, and I won't get into that tonight, so let me just move on. Verse 11. And the king of the south, moved with rage, shall come out and fight against the king of the north. There you are, north, south. And he shall raise a great multitude, but it shall be given into his hand. And verse 12 says, and when the multitude is taken away, his heart shall be exalted, and he shall cast down tens of thousands, but he shall not prevail. And so this is about 217 to 203. Ptolemy the fourth defeats Antiochus the third at Raphia. Now, what's interesting about Raphia is actually the place where Bernice and her son went and hid. So they go and they run and hide in Raphia. And, you know, all this wars that keep on going is because of Bernice being killed and her son. And so they pursue all the way to the place where she fled to. But Ptolemy the fourth, his pride prevents him from long-term success. You know, he's so proud of himself. Look what I've done. I've been able to conquer all this. And just like it says, he shall cast tens of thousands, but he shall not prevail. And we can look at that and we can say in history, he did. He defeated, he won, he conquered, but he didn't last. He wasn't a long-term king. His pride kept him from going further. Verse 13 says, for the king of the north shall raise a multitude greater than the first, and after some years he shall come on with a great army and abundant supplies. Verse 14 says, in those times many shall rise against the king of the south, and the violence among your own people shall lift themselves up in order to fulfill the vision, but they shall fail. And so he's even told that your own people, you know, the Hebrews are going to rise up, but they're not going to be able to stay ahead of this. And what we're seeing is with Antiochus Epiphanes, we have the Maccabean revolt. Jacob the Hammer who comes but you know they did good for a long time, but they couldn't withstand Rome when Rome came in. So Antiochus III returns with a massive army about 201 BC. Internal rebellions also trouble Egypt. So remember, Ptolemies they rule over Egypt, and they're trying to push forward up into Palestine, up into Israel, and they're fought against. And so all this happening at 202 to 198. Key theme here is nations rise and fall exactly as God declares. They look powerful. They look strong. Look like they got this. And I'll tell you, you can look around at the world scene today and go back over the last 30 years of America and the struggles and the troubles that we've had with Iran and the fear that Iran provoked all over the world. They kept getting these satellite little pieces of them set around everywhere, Hezbollah and all these other places. They were just attacking at will. They would attack Israel. They went in October 7th a couple years ago and killed all the people, took all those hostages, and it just looks like they're unstoppable. But today it's a different story. I don't know what tomorrow holds, though. But today it's a different story because they're more worried about their own borders because of all the shelling and the bombing and things like that are going on. Because, you know, they were a country that basically said death to Israel. They wanted Israel completely annihilated. And death to the USA. They've been chanting that since 1979. 1979, y'all, that's been a minute, right? And that's all they've ever done is chant death to the infidels, death to America, death to Israel, death to America, death to Israel. And now we finally got to the place where, like, you know what? We've had enough of this. It's been long enough. Let's just rearrange your landscape a little bit. And I hope that we're able to quash out that radical Islam that's part of all this, that drives all this. If you go back and you look at Iranian ladies in 1978 and how they dressed, very Western with skirts and short skirts and you know, nice tops and open hair, and they were very Western. They were educated. They were going to college. And then when the radicalized Islamists came in there, they set them completely back to not even the 30s. I'm talking about AD 30s, but further back, more around Abraham's time. I mean, they completely set them all the way back. And it's always the same group that's doing this, but everyone in the world just seems afraid to, you know, don't poke that dragon, don't poke that dragon. But if they're not stopped, they'll take over the world. That's their intent if they're not stopped. And so I'm glad to see things change. But again, we know through the course of history, how long would that last? Radical Islam seems to rear its ugly head in lots of different places. I got way off when I started talking about that. So about 202 to 198, this is going on. And then Daniel 11:15 says, the king of the north shall come up and throw siege works and take well-fortified city. And the forces of the south shall not stand, nor even his best troops, for there shall be no strength to stand. So this is Antiochus III conquering Sidon, capturing the Egyptian general Scopes and his fortified place. And this happened in 198 BC. So the prophecy and the fulfillment. That's what I want you to see with this study tonight. We're just racing through here. I just want you to see the prophecy, fulfillment, without a whole lot of argument about, well, it could have been this, it could have been that. But I think you can see by just studying history. Verse 16 says, but he who comes against him shall do as he wills, and none shall stand before him. He shall stand in the glorious land with destruction in his hand. So in the glorious land, that's Israel. That's God's land. And so the explanation here is Antiochus III gains control of Israel, the glorious land, about 200 BC. So you see, we're getting down to the end of the prophecy because we're getting down to where Antiochus Epiphanes comes in, and we're right on the forefront of Rome taking over all of this. But so this is the battle that's going on in the homeland. He stands in the glorious land, and it is in his hand. Destruction is in his hand. Again, glorious land equals Israel, Judah. Antiochus III gains control over Judah from Egypt, so the northern king comes down and conquers and takes over the southern king's area there in the Holy Land. Isn't it funny? There's always a battle over the Holy Land? Always a battle over the Holy Land. We've got some people running around and say, well, you know, that was then, this is now, this is grace, this is a different world, but we're still battling over the same piece of land. Still fighting over the same cousins, still trying to kill each other. You can go all the way back to Abraham with Hagar, and Abraham with Sarah and the two sons, and the fight that's been going on ever since then. You still see it going on in the world today. There was a battle of Panium. It was near Banias, about 200 to 198. That's when this took place. It was effective Seleucid control from about 198 onward. So it's the Seleucid that then have control of that land. And this is where Antiochus Epiphanes comes from. And Antiochus Epiphanes, I keep referencing him because he's the one that's also a picture of, in a lot of people's theology, of the future Antichrist to come. He's that little horn that was represented on the goat's horn. You remember that? He's the picture there. But look at all these other kings that came in the meantime. And so what Daniel saw with the four horns, the single horn that broke off, there were four horns, and there was one little horn. Skipped a whole lot of kings. But all those other little kings, all they had was skirmishes and battles and things like that. But there's one coming, little horn, that was going to be terrible, and terrible for God's people. So you have to understand that history is his story. It's God's story. It's about what he's done and how he's done things. And so we only see the highlights. Have you ever noticed how many people are not mentioned in the Old Testament? There's millions of people that were born and lived and died, and not one reference in the Old Testament. And every once in a while there's a woman that's mentioned. I say whenever you read a woman's name in Scripture, you need to look her up because she played a very big role, because they didn't in general report on who the women were, just the fathers and who they fathered and the sons that they fathered, basically. Even going back as far as patriarchs, going back to Jacob and Dinah, she's mentioned, but we don't have anything about her really. Other than, when she was attacked, the brothers got read about that and killed off a bunch of people because you don't touch their daughter, their sister, right? So the important thing is that God is painting a picture for the flow for Christ. There's a whole lot of things going on in China we're not told a thing about. A whole lot of things going on in the rest of the world we don't know a thing in the world about. When it talks about the world, it's talking about the world that they knew, their world, not the globe, so to speak. So it's interesting that these things are brought out, and we're headed up to Antiochus Epiphanes. Verse 17 says, he shall set his face to come with the strength of his whole kingdom, and he shall bring terms of an agreement and perform them. He shall give him the daughter of women to destroy the kingdom, but it shall not stand or be to his advantage. So Antiochus III gives his daughter, Cleopatra, to Ptolemy V to control Egypt. She sides against her father with Egypt. This is recorded history. we can know about this. That, he's trying to. So they did this a lot. They'd marry their daughters off to kings that they're battling with, so that there wouldn't be any more battling, hoping that she would be an influence for them. And instead, she sides with the other people. Of course, if your dad gives you away to somebody and you didn't want to go away, you may have a vendetta against your dad. And I think we see the evidence here. What's interesting is the historical precision in this, dealing with Cleopatra the first to Ptolemy the fifth to control Egypt, and her siding with her father. This matches Greco-Roman accounts perfectly. This is exactly what happened. This is the kind of stuff people read that and say, there's no way this was written before it happened. This had to be written after it. So we're saying Daniel was written in about 500 BC, just ballparking, right? And they're saying, no, Daniel had to be written at about 150 BC because it's too accurate. Well, there's a whole lot of years between 500 and 150. And the problem is Daniel is quoted, Daniel is cited. Jeremiah is referred to by Daniel. Daniel is also referred to by another Old Testament prophet. And we know they're talking about this Daniel, and we know when those books were written, they were written way before this. And so it shows God's accuracy. And my point is that God was looking just a little bit ahead, just a few hundred years. And he knows everything. He knows the beginning from the end. He had no problem laying this out for them, and he has no problem taking care of our future as well, right? So that's Daniel 17. All of this happens in about 193 BC. And then verse 18, afterward he shall return to his face to the coastlands and shall capture many of them, but a commander shall put an end to his insolence. Indeed, he shall turn his insolence back upon him. Then he shall turn his face back towards the fortress of his own land, but he shall stumble and fall and shall not be found. So this is Antiochus III, same guy we've been talking about, that's been warring back and forth, that conquered, gave his daughter to be married. It backfired on him, and the next thing you know, he's routed and he's turned back. So Antiochus III invades Asia Minor and Greece, but the Romans defeat him. So the Romans are now becoming a player, and so we're at about 187 BC. The Romans are already becoming players. Verse 18, it says, he turns the coastlands, but is stopped by a commander. Antiochus III campaigns in Asia Minor and towards Greece. He confronted and defeated by the Romans. The key date is the Battle of Magnesia. Isn't that a great name? Milk of Magnesia. In about 190. And there was a treaty of Apamea. In 188, Rome imposed heavy terms. So this is way, all this prophecy is so far out, but he's nailing it down exactly right. Verse 19, he returns to the land, then falls. Antiochus III returned to his land, burdened by the defeat and the debts to Rome. He dies while attempting to plunder a temple in Elymas. The death of Antiochus III was 187. So we're getting closer, way out ahead of Daniel. Daniel's long dead, but he saw these things and they happened perfectly. And then the last verse for tonight. Then shall arise in his place one who shall send an extractor of tribute for the glory of the kingdom. But within a few days he shall be broken, neither in anger nor in battle. And the explanation of this historically is this is Seleucus the fourth, son of Antiochus the third. His heavy taxes to his kingdom to pay Rome's fines and is assassinated. His death opens the door to Antiochus IV, known as Epiphanes, introduced in verse 21. A successor sends tax collector, then dies. So Seleucus IV, Philopator, in Syria, 187 to 175, he sends an extractor of tribute, commonly identified as Heliodorus, to plunder the temple in Jerusalem in 178 to 176. Seleucus IV is assassinated in 175, and this paves the way for one Antiochus Epiphanes that we'll be introduced to in verse 21 of this chapter. And so you think, what has all this got to do with Daniel? What's it got to do with us? Most of us don't know any of this history. You may have heard some of these names before. Why is this in here? Remember, and we didn't go over this, but in chapter 10, the messenger tells Daniel that this is a picture of the timeline of your people. This is what's going to happen. You're in captivity now, and you've been here for a while. The people are going to let go back to the land, but they don't get to stay in the land. They go back to the land. We know that in Esther's day, most of them had gone back. They didn't get to stay there. They were conquered and run by Greece. And then Rome steps up on the scene. Rome does the same thing. They become a vassal state to Rome. And then we jump into the New Testament, and that's who's in charge, Rome. But the run-up to that is all of these Greek wars and this constant battling back and forth through the Holy Land. I mean, it's like a hotbed for battles and wars. And one of the reasons why is a narrow strait that you can pass through. King's Highway from Egypt comes through there. But to the right of Israel, if you're looking at it on a map, to the right, to the east of Israel's desert. You can't go that way. It's too far to cross. And so you have to come up through Israel, through what's called the Fertile Crescent, up around Mesopotamia, and then back down through the Tigris and Euphrates just to get down the other side of that one massive desert. So it was a constant trade war going on there, and there was trades, and there's two major roads that you can still see from satellite that cut through there, from all the ancients cutting through you. So, well, what does this got to do with where we're at today in America? The picture is that God knows precision in the future, what's history to him. When God sees it, it's a done deal, right? So it's history to God. God's not combined or trapped by time. He invades all of time. He inhabits all of time. And so he's letting Daniel know it's not over with yet. We're headed for my son to arrive. And there's going to be a lot of players. There's going to be a lot of chess. There's going to be a lot of battling back and forth. And as a matter of fact, let me show you, Daniel, how well this is going to go for my plan. This is going to happen. This guy's going to happen. There's going to be this girl. There's going to be that guy. There's going to be this. There's going to be this. But they're not going to be there long. They're going to have this, but they're not going to be able to go long. And you get all this complicated chapter 11 of prophecy that's just packed full of prophecy that hadn't happened yet, just so we can come back later and we can read on Britannica, or we can read in other historical books and say, that's exactly how it happened. Well, that gives us comfort. Because when we read Revelation, and we read the New Testament, by the time we read through the New Testament, we see the birth of the church, and then in Revelation we see the end of things. We see the end of the age, or the end of the world sometimes is translated. God wins. It happens exactly according to his timeline. It happens exactly according to his plan. He knows how it's going to go. He knows the trouble that we're going to have to live in. He knows how there's going to be wars and rumors of wars all the time. There's going to be birth pangs, and there's going to be all these things. But he says, keep your heart. Keep your faith, because he's coming back. Jesus said, basically when he's leaving, why are you standing there? Get out and get busy. And the angels even said, disciples, why are y'all standing here looking up? The same Jesus who you saw ascend is coming back in like manner. He's coming back. Coming back shortly, the Bible says. Well, it doesn't seem shortly to us, though, does it? It's kind of been a minute since he ascended, but we've got to be a lot closer now. And if God gave Daniel this kind of vision and then told him to seal it up, one of the reasons why you seal it up is because none of these players were even alive yet when Daniel wrote this. These kingdoms didn't exist as they would when Daniel wrote this. Yet Daniel knew the kingdoms, who they would be and what they would control and how they would battle. And God gave it to Daniel all these years ago. 2,500 years ago, Daniel wrote this. And through the last, 2,500 years, we've seen this fulfilled. And we also have more prophecy that we haven't even walked into yet, but God says this is how it's going to go. And it still is murky and confusing to us, but one of these days we're going to look back from glory and say, exactly like he said. We just didn't understand it looking forward. Amen? Well, I hope it's encouraging. I know it's a lot. It's like drinking from a fire hydrant, but that's the best way for me to get through that. Yes, sir. Really? Same old spirit. Yeah, it was. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. A descendant. And it's funny because the same families are represented. Yeah, it is. Yeah, that's exactly what they're after. They want to bring back that Persia of old, even though the people that are there in the Islamic State are not Persians. You know, they're Arabs and things like that that have crept in with this Islamic religion and they've taken over. Yeah, it is. And you know, we think that's ancient history. What's that got to do today? It's still being battled over today. Destined to repeat it. That's exactly right. And it goes back to, like I said, it goes back to Abraham and Hagar and Ishmael and Isaac, and they're still fighting, still fighting, still fighting, and they're still fighting in the same land that God made all these prophecies about. What's going to happen here? What's going to happen there? And it's still clicking right along. I mean, if you look at it and you go and look at the battles that have been fought and the wars, and you think about Beirut, and when you think about Iran, and that how it was, you know, it's been accused that the British people are the ones that kind of set them up and put them in this place and kind of looked the other way when they got more and more radicalized. And it's kind of like, you know, Saddam Hussein, you know, was somebody that, you know, the America had ties with. And then they're actually enemies of America. They always were, but they'll take our money. Yeah. Don't trust. Because right off the bat, at night, yeah. That's the same way in Korea. Yeah. It's different. See, here's the thing: is we have a Western mindset. We think our logic. It's Aristotelian. It goes back to Aristotle, and we have a certain way of thinking. The Middle East does not have the same way of thinking, and so you know you think you're having a conversation with somebody from another land, but the whole time you don't really know what they're thinking because it is about conquer. That's Islam. It's about conquering, and they want to conquer the whole world. They want a caliphate of the whole world. They want to reinstate Islam across the whole world. That's why they keep setting up all these small things. Islam is not a peaceful religion. Now, there's peaceful people in Islam. There really are. They're not all trying to cut our throats. But the monster that drives it goes all the way back to the Garden of Eden. And he wants to take the place of God. And he's done that through this one religion for sure. And yeah, death by a thousand cuts. And so it's the same battle, Garden of Eden. It's the exact same battle. It's just more people involved in it. And a lot of people are deceived, are blinded, and without the truth of Christ, they can never see the light. And so that's our job, is to be that witness. Even to those people that want to cut our throats, they need Jesus. They need Jesus terribly. And one of these days we'll look at the end of the book and we'll say, you know what, Jesus wins. He really does. But it is a cosmic battle. He's already won, right? Yeah. We just haven't done the march yet with him, right? Good statements, brother. Thank you. Anybody else tonight? Y'all ready to go? Well, we've prayed, we've eaten, we've fellowshiped, laughed a little bit. Let's be dismissed. Y'all be safe, okay? I think it's quit raining, so go while you can.